Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1883. The wind scraped low across the dry hills outside of Laramie. And inside the grand house built by railroad money, a young woman scrubbed floors with red, raw hands. Temperance Whitlow dipped her rag into cold, gray water and wrung it out tight. The soap bit at the cracks in her skin. Her knees ached on the hardwood. She kept her eyes down because if she looked up, she might see her reflection in the polished oak panels, and she hated what stared back. A girl in a plain dress, hair tied back hard, shoulders hunched like a mule under harness. "Faster," barked Mrs. Haverton from the parlor doorway, her lace collar stiff as her tone. "You're not being paid to rest." Temperance didn't answer. She never did. Silence was safer. The Havertons liked her quiet and invisible. She had been scrubbing their floors for nearly 2 years now, ever since her father's debts had passed to her after his death. She had no family left, no one to write to, no one to come for her, until he walked in. Elijah North stepped through the front door with the wind behind him. Dust clung to his long coat and the brim of his hat. His boots were caked with dried mud and trail dust. He was tall, lean in the way cowboys were all muscle and movement, and he had that still kind of presence that made a room pause. Temperance looked up for the first time in hours. Their eyes met. He blinked. Then slowly, his mouth parted like he was seeing a ghost. "Temperance." She froze, the rag slipping from her fingers. No one had said her name like that in years, soft, surprised, like it meant something, like she was not just a servant. "Elijah!" Her voice cracked. Mrs. Haverton stepped forward quickly, frowning. "You know this girl?" Elijah took off his hat. He looked older than she remembered, sun-worn, sharper around the jaw, but it was him. Her childhood friend from the ranch downriver. The boy who used to sneak her wild plums. The boy who had once promised to come back for her. "I did," he said, eyes still on Temperance. "I do." "Well, she works for us now," Mrs. Haverton said curtly. "And she has floors to finish." He ignored her. "Temperance, what are you doing here?" She shook her head. "It's fine. I owe them money. It's not forever." Mrs. Haverton scoffed. "She's here on contract. 7 more months. Unless you have $500 lying around, Cowboy, I suggest you be on your way." Elijah's jaw tensed. He turned slowly toward Mrs. Haverton. "I do." "What?" "I'll pay it," he said. "Right now." Temperance stood so fast she nearly slipped. "Elijah, no. You do not owe me that." "I know," he said quietly. "And I am not asking anything in return." Mrs. Haverton narrowed her eyes. "We need it in cash." "I can bring it by sundown," he said. "Will that be acceptable?" Mrs. Haverton hesitated, then gave a tight nod. "Fine. But if you are late, the deal's off." Temperance followed him out to the porch when no one was looking. The wind tugged at her dress, and the world outside felt too big after so long indoors. "Elijah, why would you do that?" He looked down at her. "Because I remember you, Temperance. You are not meant to be someone's servant. I cannot pay you back. I never asked you to." She was quiet, her heart pounding. "What will you do after?" He smiled faintly. "Take you somewhere you can breathe again. That is all." She watched him ride off, dust rising behind his horse like a promise. By sundown, he returned on horseback, saddlebag heavy with coin. He paid every cent without blinking, and just like that, she was free. That night, she stood outside the Haverton house with nothing but a satchel in her hand. Elijah waited beside his horse with the reins ready. She looked back once at the windows, the polished floors, the faces that had never cared, then turned away for good. They rode in silence for a while, the stars coming out over the plains. When she started to shiver, he took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You did not have to do this," she said again. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." She looked over at him. Why? He hesitated, then met her eyes. Because I never forgot you, and I will not leave you behind again. Her breath caught in her throat, but she said nothing. Not yet. They rode until the moon was high, and the trail curved toward a quiet cabin tucked near a riverbend. He helped her down and lit the lantern inside. "This place is yours?" she asked. He nodded. "Built it 3 years back. It is simple, but it is dry and warm." She looked around with walls, a stone hearth, a small bed in the corner. It smelled like pine and tobacco and something steady. "You can have the bed," he said gently. "I will set up on the floor." "Elijah, it is your first night free. You should sleep well." She watched him stoke the fire, his hands steady, his presence calm. He had not touched her, had not asked her for anything. He had just come back like he said he would. And something in her chest, long buried, stirred. She sat near the fire beside him. "Thank you." He glanced at her. "You do not have to thank me." "I do," she said, "because no one else ever would have." He looked at her for a long time. The firelight danced in his eyes. Then he nodded once, and they sat in silence, listening to the wind move through the trees. Outside, the wild stretched wide and empty. Inside, hope took its first breath. The cabin held its warmth well through the night. By morning, the fire had burned low to embers, and the faint gray light of dawn filtered through the chinks in the shutters. Temperance stood by the hearth, wrapping Elijah's coat tighter around her. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke. Elijah stirred from the braided rug by the hearth, where he'd bedded down with a saddle blanket and his hat pulled over his eyes. He sat up slow, rubbing the back of his neck. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I did," she answered. "Some. You're up early." "I'm not used to sleeping with no one calling out orders before sunup." He nodded and stood, stretching without a word. Then he went to the wash basin near the door and poured a little water from the metal pitcher, splashing his face. The cabin was quiet but not uncomfortable. The silence between them held no weight, only space. She turned to him. "Do you still keep horses?" "I've got 5 now, 2 for riding, 1 gelding I raised from a foal, and a pair of draft maras for hauling. They're kept in the north pasture, near the cottonwoods." "You run all this alone?" He picked up a tin mug and filled it with water. "Mostly. I hire help during branding and harvest. But I don't much like crowds." She folded her arms. "You always did prefer quiet." He looked at her then, really looked like he was trying to find the girl he once knew beneath the woman who stood before him now. "You still play the fiddle?" She blinked. "No. Haven't touched one in years." "That's a shame. You were good." She lowered her eyes. "My father sold it the winter after the cattle died. Said music wouldn't feed us." Elijah didn't speak for a long moment. Then he stepped closer, his movements unhurried. "If you wanted, I could take you into town this Sunday. There's a man there who sells second-hands. Might be one lying around. I didn't come here to ask for more. I didn't offer out of pity." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Sunday." He stepped back and reached for his boots. "You hungry?" She looked toward the small shelf near the hearth. "I could make us something, if you've got cornmeal and lard. In the crate by the wall. I'll fetch eggs." By the time he returned from the henhouse, she had cornbread frying in a cast-iron skillet. He passed her the eggs, and she cracked them one by one, deft as a woman who'd done it 1,000 times. "You sure you want to stay?" he asked as he leaned against the doorframe. She didn't lift her head. "You sure you want me here?" "I wouldn't have brought you if I didn't." She turned the cornbread with the spatula. "I don't want to be a burden." "You aren't." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased a little. They ate at the small pine table near the window, the morning light slanting across the floor in soft stripes. Afterward, Elijah set about chopping kindling just outside, and Temperance took to scrubbing the skillet clean with ash and water. Later, she explored the land behind the cabin on foot. The slope led down to the river, where cottonwoods stood tall and the water moved slow and steady. A few fence posts leaned tiredly near the bank, and tufts of golden grass gave way to bare earth where cattle had trod. She crouched near the water's edge and dipped her fingers in. It was cold and clear. Behind her, she heard footfalls. "Fence needs mending," Elijah said, a coil of wire in hand. "Spring runoff took out part of it." She straightened. "I can help." "You don't have to." "I know." He handed her a pair of gloves. "Watch for barbs." They worked side by side in the quiet, the kind only open land could offer. Birds rustled in the brush, and the sun rose higher as their shadows shortened. Elijah taught her how to twist the wire taut and secure the posts. Her palms ached, but she didn't complain. When the last post was fastened, they sat in the grass, boots dusty, hands sore. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" she asked. He looked out across the hills. "Sometimes, but then I remember the way the light falls in late autumn, or the sound of the river after a storm. And I figure there's nowhere else I'd rather be." She picked a blade of grass and twisted it. "I used to dream about California, or even Chicago, somewhere with music. But now I don't know what I'd do with all that noise." He glanced at her. "You're not the same girl who used to draw pictures in the dirt behind the schoolhouse. And you're not the boy who used to sleep in the hayloft just to get away from the shouting." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "No, I'm not." They sat a while longer, the silence between them easy now, like it belonged there. That night, after the sun dipped low and the fire was lit again, she stood near the hearth brushing out her hair. Elijah was seated at the table, oiling his saddle. The room smelled of leather and pine smoke. "I'd like to earn my keep," Temperance said. He didn't look up. "You already do." "I mean it. Cooking, helping with the animals, mending things. I don't want to be idle." He set down the rag. "All right, if that's what you want." "It is." He nodded. "Then we'll start early." She turned toward the cot but paused. "Elijah." "Yeah. I remembered something last night. You once said you wanted a place where no one could take anything from you." He met her gaze across the firelight. "I did. Is this that place?" He nodded slowly. "It is now." She said nothing more, but her breath came steadier as she lay down that night. The wind moved against the windows, soft and steady, and for the first time in years, she didn't dread the morning. The following week settled into a rhythm as natural as breath. Temperance rose before the sky lightened, pulled her shawl close against the crisp air, and stepped into the work without waiting to be told. She fed the hens, swept ash from the hearth, and walked the fence line with Elijah when the sun began to stretch across the grasslands. There were no orders barked, no eyes watching her every movement, only the quiet companionship of a man who offered space instead of demand. On the fourth morning, she found him in the barn, brushing down the younger of the draft mares. The animal leaned into the strokes, large eyes half lidded from comfort. Elijah didn't look up until she stepped into the stall. "She's favoring her left side," she said, kneeling to check the hoof. "She bruised it on a stone last week. I wrapped it 2 days back, but I reckon she'll need rest another few." Temperance ran her fingers along the fetlock. "You've always had a hand for animals." His voice was quiet. "They don't expect more than what you give. That's a kind of peace." She nodded and stood. "I'd like to take her place on the hauling team while she heals. If you'll let me." He set down the brush. "You sure? I've pulled timber before. I can handle a harness." He studied her face. "All right, We'll cut from the creek bank after breakfast. The haul took most of the day. She worked beside him, shoulders straining as they dragged felled limbs up the slope and stacked them near the woodpile. Sweat beaded at her temples, her breath coming harder with each trip, but she never faltered. Elijah offered her water, and she took it with a nod, her hand brushing his when he passed the canteen. Neither pulled away. When they'd finished, dusk had begun to gather in the hollows between hills. They sat on the porch steps, arms resting on their knees, boots caked with dirt. A pair of owls called from somewhere beyond the trees. The quiet stretched long. "You hear from anyone in town?" she asked. He shook his head. "Only when I go in for supplies. Most folks keep to themselves out here. I imagine they ask questions when they see me with you. They've asked worse things in the past." He paused. "I told them you're helping on the ranch, that you'll stay as long as you want." She looked down at her hands. "They'll assume more than that." "I don't care what they assume." Her voice thinned. "I do." He turned toward her, not touching, just watching. "If you ever want to leave, I'll take you wherever you want to go." She met his gaze. "And if I don't? Then you stay same as now." The fireflies had begun to flicker in the tall grass. She listened to them in the hush. "I don't know how to live without waiting for the next thing to fall apart." Elijah didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Most things fall apart, but some things hold if you build them careful." She drew a slow breath. "And what would we be building?" He looked out toward the pasture. "Something worth waking up for." The words sat between them, unforced. She didn't answer, but she didn't turn away either. On Sunday morning, he took her into town as promised. The streets were dusty, and the general store smelled of grain and tobacco. She lingered near the back where the owner kept a few old instruments hung on pegs. Her fingers hovered over a fiddle with a sun-bleached neck. Elijah paid for it without a word and handed it to her as they stepped outside. "You should play again," he said. She held it gingerly. "I might have forgotten how." "Then remember." They rode back in companionable quiet, the fiddle wrapped in burlap across her lap. That night, she tuned it by the fire, shoulders tight with old nerves. Elijah didn't press, just sat nearby, whittling a piece of cedar. After a long pause, she set bout a string and played a slow, winding tune, something half-remembered from childhood, something aching and low. Elijah looked up once, then back down to his carving. But his hands had gone still. When she finished, the room was thick with something neither of them named. "I'd forgotten how that sounded," he said. "I didn't know I needed to hear it again." She set the fiddle beside the hearth. He stood and walked past her, pausing at the door to the bedroom. "I'll sleep out here again," he said. She rose and stepped toward him, her voice low. "You don't have to." He turned, surprised. "You sure?" She nodded. "I'm not afraid anymore." He brushed a hand along her cheek, just once, and she leaned into it. Their foreheads touched, breath mingling. "I never needed more than this," he murmured. She still hadn't let go of his hand when the lantern burned low. Late October brought a shift to the land, quieter winds, brittle leaves underfoot, and the kind of cold that settled deep in the bones after sundown. Elijah had begun stacking the last of the split wood along the north wall, and Temperance spent her afternoons stitching padded liners into their winter coats from scrap flannel kept in a cedar chest. The rhythm of days held steady, but there was something different now between them, less space, less carefulness, like a fence taken down and left where it fell. One morning, she found him at the workbench behind the barn, shaping new handles for the kitchen tools that had cracked in the dry air. He paused when she approached, thumb running over the grain of the wood. "I thought we might ride out to the ridge tomorrow," he said. "There's a trail up through the red rock that opens onto the valley." I figure it's near the last week we'll get decent light. She brushed sawdust from the edge of the bench. You don't mind me slowing you down? He glanced up. I'd rather take it slow with you than fast alone. She didn't answer, only nodded once and turned to check the saddle cinches for wear. They left before dawn the next day, wrapped in wool and carrying bread and jerky tied in waxed cloth. The sky was still iron dark when they set out, hooves muffled on the frost-hardened path. Elijah led them through the thinning aspens, then up a narrow pass where the trail curved between slabs of sandstone. They reached the ridge as the sun broke, casting long shadows over the valley below, miles of tawny grassland and distant black hills stitched with cottonwoods. Temperance reined in beside him, eyes fixed on the land. I didn't know it could look like this, she said. Elijah kept his gaze forward. It's always looked like this. You just haven't had the time to see it. They dismounted and sat on the sun-warmed stone. She pulled her knees close, the wind tugging at loose tendrils of her hair. Do you think you'll ever marry? She asked suddenly. He didn't look at her right away. I used to think I would, but I never wanted to ask someone to step into a life that's all work and weather and not much else. Temperance turned her face toward the wind. Maybe that's not all it is. He watched her for a moment. Would it be enough for you? I don't need more than what's honest. He shifted closer, his voice low. I wouldn't ask it of you unless I knew you wanted it. She reached for his hand, fingers threading through his, bare against the sun-warmed rock. I'm not waiting for you to ask. I'm telling you I already chose it. They sat without speaking, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, the wind combing through the grass behind them. That evening, once the horses were stabled and the fire caught in the hearth again, Temperance spread the quilt across the bed while Elijah checked the door latch. She watched him from across the room as he banked the fire, his movements quiet and certain. Elijah! He turned, brows lifted slightly. I want you to stay here tonight. He crossed the room slowly, stopping in front of her. Not because you feel you owe me. No, she said, because I don't. He touched her face, the roughness of his palm grounding. Then I will. They lay together beneath the quilt, the warmth of his body easing the chill from her limbs. He didn't rush, didn't press, just held her like she wasn't something fragile, but something whole. In the early hours, when the fire had burned low and the night outside was still, she whispered into the space between them, I never thought I'd belong to something again. He pressed his lips to her temple. You belong here. With me. Her arms tightened around him. Outside, snow began to fall in thin, silent threads. Inside, they didn't stir. They had nothing left to run from, only something to build, steady as the land beneath them. By late November, the high meadows had turned to frost-bitten gold, and the earth carried the scent of turned leaves and wood smoke. The days shortened, and morning light came pale and late across the land. Elijah had finished reinforcing the barn roof, and Temperance had stitched heavier curtains for the windows, the thick wool keeping the cold from pressing in too deep. Their days held a kind of quiet fullness, not hurried, not idle, just steady. On a windless afternoon, she stood outside the cabin, watching a string of wild turkeys move through the brush below the slope. Elijah sat on a stump nearby, sharpening the blade of his drawknife, the rasping sound steady. Do you miss working cattle? She asked. He paused, testing the edge with his thumb. Sometimes, but I don't miss riding fence for other men or sleeping under canvas more nights than not. She stepped over to him. I wonder sometimes what it'd be like to build something from the ground up. Not just keep things running, but make something new. He looked up. You thinking of something in particular? I've had this thought, just a thought of raising milk goats. Folks around here have to ride 2 days to get cheese or butter unless they make it themselves. Could be something worth trying. He set the blade aside. You'd want to stay here long enough for that? She nodded. I already have, haven't I? You have. She knelt beside him, brushing wood shavings from the hem of her skirt. We'd need fencing, a shed for shelter. I could write to my mother's cousin in Missouri. She kept goats. Knew a thing or two about breeding lines. I'll help you build it. She studied his face. You always say that. Because I mean it. He reached for her hand, calloused fingers wrapping around hers. You've given this place more than it ever had before you came. Their hands stayed joined as the light shifted and the turkeys vanished into the trees. That evening, Elijah slid a small wooden box onto the table after supper. The lid was carved with a simple wheat motif, neat, precise, and unmistakably made by his hand. Temperance opened it slowly. Inside lay a silver ring, unadorned but finely made, the metal catching the lamplight. He cleared his throat. I know I've never had much to offer, and I don't suppose that's changed. But I'd like to make a life with you, one that's honest and quiet and built to last. She didn't speak right away, only touched the ring with a fingertip, then looked up at him, eyes steady. I've never trusted a home before this one, she said. But I trust you. He took that as answer, and when he slid the ring onto her finger, her hands didn't tremble. They were married 3 days later, under the cottonwoods near the frozen bend in the river. The preacher came from Laramie, riding out in the cold with a black coat buttoned to the throat and a Bible wrapped in wool. Elijah stood tall in his cleanest shirt, and Temperance wore a dress the color of faded linen, mended neat at the sleeves. There were no guests, only the wind and the river and the hush of snow beginning to fall. After the vows, Elijah kissed her with reverence, his hand resting warm against her cheek. She leaned into him, her breath catching just once before settling. There was no applause, no music, only the sound of two lives folding into each other without fanfare. Winter settled in earnest not long after. Snow drifted high along the cabin walls, and the creek froze clear through. They passed the days in the small circle of warmth they'd made, splitting wood, mending tack, reading from the few books they kept on the shelf. Temperance began her letters to Missouri, and Elijah cleared space near the southern slope for spring fencing. Some nights she played the fiddle, soft tunes that drifted through the rafters while Elijah carved or read aloud. Other nights they said little, content in the quiet, his hand finding hers beneath the quilt. Come February, a letter arrived from her cousin, offering to send 2 bread does come spring, along with a list of feed and care notes written in a tidy hand. Temperance read it aloud by the fire, her voice bright with purpose. Elijah watched her from across the room. So it begins. She smiled. Not begins. Grows. By April, the goats arrived in a cart driven by a neighbor from the next valley over. They built a shelter from reclaimed barn wood, and she named the animals after wildflowers. Elijah learned to milk by watching her hands, and they laughed through more than one failed attempt at soft cheese. The days lengthened. The land greened. In time, their home grew fuller. A cradle carved from pine by Elijah's own hand sat near the hearth 2 summers later, and the child they'd once only dreamed of slept there, wrapped in a quilt Temperance had sewn before the first frost of the year. Their life remained quiet, but it was never small. Each day built upon the last, not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of choosing one another, again and again. And though the wind still swept the valley and the snow still came each year, it never found them alone.